Let's talk about how your team can make the most of the offseason for the 2026-27 BioBuzz FTC season. I'm Coach Pratt, and I've been teaching robotics for over a decade now, and I've mentored FTC teams to national championship wins, multiple Inspire Board wins, and then multiple world championship attendance. And First has made a whack-a-load of changes this year for the offseason, so it makes it one of the most targeted off-seasons yet for best preparing for the next season. So let's take a look at what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk all about the game element that was released. It's the first time First has ever done like this, so it'll be interesting to chat about that. We'll talk about some of the official resources they've released. They've already released some things that I'm calling a StarterBots Lite, and then they're kind of half of a StarterBot kit. They've also released a series of skill builders that should give us some good clues into what it is we need to build for the next game. Then I'll share out some of the best resources that I have currently created for things that relate to those skill builders, as well as I'll make some predictions as to where I think the game will go. Now, I want to make a quick note there. I'm not at all affiliated with First or any of their official partners or anything like that. I just happen to be a coach that likes talking to people about robots. So I have no insider knowledge, and my crystal ball may turn out to be radically incorrect based on this. So I just want to have that caveat before we go. So if you have yet to see it, this new season is all about bees. Yes, it's a biodiversity based, and First has released for the first time that I'm aware, they've released the game element before the game has actually started. So this is a 3-inch or about 7.5-ish centimeters wiffle ball. It is the same wiffle ball. It's a standard wiffle ball. It's actually made by Resident. So if you can have a Resident TM, you'll likely be able to find the exact same wiffle ball yourself. It's not near as compressible as the decode element was to be able to punch in these things, but still is quite compressible. My guess is it's probably made of the same plastic. It just feels like it's less compressible because you have smaller holes inside of these as well. If your team achieved the World Championships this season, you did get 3 of these to bring home with you. If not, you can buy some of these before. I'd recommend that if you do, at least get a couple, get your hands on a few, and if not more than a few. And we'll talk about more than a few in a bit here. So there is a First community post that got sent out where there is a lot of things that they have released. Of course, we've already talked about the scoring element, and it seems to me like you're going to have to be able to pick up quite a few of these, almost similar to what FRC's Fuel did this season in the rebuilt season as well. They've also talked about some tasks that you need to have. Now, obviously, they're not going to reveal everything, but they've already said some things. So you're going to have to be able to take the pollen up from the field. You're going to be able to intake multiples at the same time, whether it's in a line or in piles of pollen. They've already shown you here, as well as getting it against field borders and field corners. So you should be able to grab these things out from the sections there. They've also noticed that you should be able to how to autonomously navigate between known locations and intake pollen without any human intervention. So the key part here being known locations. And typically how First does these things in the past, when they talk about known locations, they're talking about April tags. So if you don't know how to read an April tag, that is a great place to start. Similarly, what happened the decode season as well is you also did have the artifacts or the balls falling into a known location, being in those corners once you open up those gates. However, teams that were able to use camera vision, use color blobs, and be able to sense where larger blobs were more effective at being able to pick up some of these things inside those autonomous areas. And we'll talk more about that later. They have also released 4 different StarterBot bases. I'm calling them StarterBot Lights for the most part, in that they have a drivetrain and they have an intake. So if we look at Go Buildas, Starter Robot here, they have a 6-wheel intake here. They have a geared up section for their intake here. I believe this is this is geared down. They probably have their 6,000 RPM running into this, running it down to about 1,000 RPM to be able to do their intake. Seems to have been how they've thrown that together. They do have a 6-wheeled chassis on here. Theirs is a 4 wheels, which are traction wheels, and 2 which are Omni. But interestingly enough, when you look at their 6-wheeled chassis, it is, of course, a drop center, but they only have power to the rear 2 wheels. It does not look like there is a power chain to the front 2 omnidirectional wheels, only in the back for their turning. This is also a drop center, meaning that at any point in time, only 2 of these are contacting. Now, Go Build a Starter Bot does kind of give us a note that likely you're not going to run into or first likely isn't to change the 18 inches or 45.74 centimeters cubed measurement here, because this is, of course, 17.8 by 16.77, and likely their official starter bot is not going to run that. Looking at official starter bot as well, they have two intakes here to be able to grab something from the corner. They also have a just section of compliant wheels. And then they also have a counter roller down on the bottom here to be able to pick some of that pollen up off of the ground. Now, we'll talk more about intake designs as we get later on in the video. I want to talk more about this first, but now's a good time to start with that experimenting. So my guess is this is the 117 motor here that is then with a quite high gear up, 1 to 5 to get it to about 1200 RPM to be able to actually bring in these as well. Now, when we look at the Rev starter robot here, the Rev starter robot does have a very similar setup. It is a 6-wheeled chassis with a Omni wheel in the back. Again, it doesn't look like it's drop centered, but there is a much larger wheel in the middle, as well as just some boot kickers here going up a slight ramp as well. So it's just a sheet of polycarbonate that these boot kickers are then driving up into this. Similar deal here with the Studica. Now, I must say that the Studica starter robot is significantly less well-resourced than the other two have been set up to this point. They are releasing these things as they go, but at least this time of recording, there's not a whack load there. Again, kind of boot kickers here, but it looks like they've gone down the road of just having a flat wall to be able to have this thing then just lift itself back up. And then, of course, AndyMark also has their starter bot as well, using their gear setups and some rubber bands set up for that as well to be able to just pick it up into their rover. Now, Studica and AndyMark are using 4-wheeled chassis. Rev and GoBuilder are using 6-wheeled chassis. One of two things might come for these 6 wheels. One, it's just significantly more stable than 4 wheels and trying to level themselves up. That's one possibility. Another possibility of having 6 wheels is that it's a little easier to go over terrain and things like that. So there's a possibility there. For those not familiar in FTC history, there is some examples of using terrain in past games, having to jump up and over 2 or 3 centimeter or 1 inch, 1.5 inch bumps for terrain and things like that. So that's another option. Another option is that a 6-wheel chassis has significantly more traction, which means it's easier to push another robot out of the way. So we might see more kind of pushing robots or more kind of defense coming up that was similar to this season as well. So that's looking at the starter base light. And then they've also released something they're calling skill builders. Now, FTC skill builders here, unfortunately, you do have to set up a first account to be able to access these. I don't really know why. I'm not sure why they didn't just put it up in a public atmosphere. But in any case, if you have a first account, you can get access to be able to download these. And there are several different tasks that you have to go through. And let's go through the 7 challenges they did, because their challenge was going to be able to give us a good overview into what kind of things we might end up seeing. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. So the first challenge here is there's just effectively a driving challenge. If you've never got an FTC before, being able to drive a robot around is really important. We saw that in Teleop. Having strong driving skills is, of course, a must, and there's nothing really to glean from this first challenge. The second one, similarly, it is parking in specific known locations. So again, nothing really here that we're really going to be able to glean outside of, are you decent at driving? When it starts coming into things start to gleam some ideas, we now have the ability to pick up pollen from different areas around the field and then bring it back to a loading zone where human players are now going to start bringing it out. We have another aspect here in this challenge as well. I believe this is challenge number 5, pollen rush. Similar idea, but you take that same idea that they did in challenge number 4 and you're now doing it in teams. So one team has to come out, grab as many pollen as they can, and then bring it into this center goal. Now, the interesting thing about this is we're going to be able to start gleaming some ideas from this. This challenge uses an optional high goal, requiring the robot to lift the ball off the ground. The taller the goal, the greater the challenge. They're reusing buckets here for it looks like from the Into the Deep season as well. You're now doing head-to-head is just one suggested option in terms of where you might set up the field. And then the big Idea here is that you can bring it back to the low goal, let a human player take things out, or you can bring it up into a high goal. Now, it does seem a little bit odd to me that they would suggest as a skill builder to be able to move pollen to a different plane. So likely we're going to see the expansion limits being gone and coming back. It would seem surprising to me if they had brought some way of doing this before. There is another section here where it's talking about having RoboPut, and the RoboPut is the idea is you actually want to take your intake and then modify it so that it can spit a single pollen back out as well. So likely you're going to have some way of bringing the pollen out of your robot. Of course, that's probably relatively similar or probably relatively well known. But the question is, you may be able to dump a whole bunch out onto the ground in a low zone. So if you can reverse your intake, whether it is your hopper when you're bringing in a whole bunch of these things, reversing them to kick them back out, might be a decent avenue to go. You should also likely prepare to move these things to different heights and elements as well. And the last one here, the last two challenges are mostly referred to as autonomous pathing, as well as autonomous picking up in those last couple skill challenges. So be able to pick up these pollen in a line, as well as be able to follow a path around the field here. So a lot of really interesting skill builders being put out here. It seems clear to me that there's going to be a lot more autonomous, and hopefully they put a lot more emphasis into autonomous this season, particularly because they're talking about teams wanting to get more autonomous vision. So if you have the ability to, particularly for more advanced teams, getting something like a color blob detection, where you're able to move towards certain blobs of things like that, might be an interesting place to go to kind of help guide you through some of those resources. Of course, First has their own, but I also have a whack load of tutorials. I've spent a better year and a half of my life developing. I've got a full playlist here on different robotics building concepts, things like gear ratios, things like linear slides, things like telescopic slides. How do you do wire robots? How do you do odometry? How do you do 4-bar lifts, virtual 4-bar lifts, rack and pinion systems? There's a whole bunch of different basic robotic mechanisms that I've got set up here in a playlist that would be worthwhile to take a look at. Similarly, when it comes down to programmers, the computer vision side, I also have a decent chunk of tutorials here on understanding limelights. How do you move around limelights? How do you know where you are in the field? How do you align to different things? How do you have color vision using the limelight and April tags? And so on and so forth. I've got a video all about wiring, and the reason I bring this one up specifically is because I saw quite a few matches of the World Championships this season, particularly high-level matches where robots were disconnecting due to likely some different ESD events or things of those nature. So I highly suggest you watch it in my playlist here, get some of my best tips on avoiding some of those ESD events so that your robot doesn't disconnect in the middle of a match. Particularly, I will say one thing on that, don't have large aluminum side panels out on the outside or carbon fiber. They are electrically conductive. You should have some sort of non-conductive surface on the outside. Despite that aluminum looking cool, might not be the best. I also have a whole series here just on making intakes, and conveniently, the intake designs that worked for Decode will likely also work for this season with some slight modifications. So if you're looking for some starter CAD files, things like that on different types of ball intakes, compliant wheel intakes, of course, I'm going to have more as well related this season. Take a look at some of these first 4 videos as well. And last thing I'll talk about is some autonomous pathing. Of course, pager pathing is fantastic. I'm a big fan of it. They've also released in release 2.1, and I'll have some tutorials coming out on that in the future for some of that debugging. Now, let's get a little bit into that crystal ball factor here. And the reason I say crystal ball is, again, I have no knowledge of what the game is actually going to be. My best guess is where yours are at. But here's what I might be thinking in terms of some generalities about the game. One, I don't think there's going to be a control limit on the number of pollen that you're able to pick up. Reason being for that, it's a nightmare for refs to have to judge. And I don't think it's realistic to say you can only have 30 or you can only have 6, you can only have 10 or whatever. If it is a large number, I would be really surprised if you could not pick up and just have an unlimited control limit within the bounds of what your robot is, of course, allowed to able to hold in that sort of likely 18-inch cube. Again, I don't know about verticality, but the Studica robot is quite tall when we look at that. So I highly doubt that you're not going to have 18 inches of vertical as well, just looking at this setup here. So the 18-inch cube is likely coming back. Another aspect on that no control limit, when we look at that rev video for their starter robot, it shows a whack load of pollen, and this thing be able to pick up a whack load of pollen as well. It would be surprising to me if they were showing off a video talking about how you might pick these things up, or having games called Hungry Hippos and things like that to be able to pick up as much pollen as possible if you weren't able to collect a whole bunch. So building an intake, at least what I'm going to have my teams focusing on, or at least rather suggesting that my teams focus on, is building a rather rock solid intake. Make sure that when you grab this thing, you take it and you own it, and you can take up 20, 30, 40, however many pollen you're just physically capable of grabbing, and iterating through a bunch of different intake designs as well. I'm also thinking that there's likely going to be a center element. And the reason that I suggest having a center element is just by looking at the cost price difference between a partial set and a full set. So a full set is $600, a partial set is $400. That's not a significant price difference between the two, which means there's likely going to be a center field element. When you looked at the G-code season, it was almost half the cost. Actually, it was about half the cost, because you had discrete goals on either side to have a partial set or a full set, whereas the Into the Deep season, full set and partial set were more similar in cost. Similarly here, we're also saying that, again, a full game set is about a partial set is about 2/3 the price of a full game set. So likely there's going to be some sort of shared element coming along that, and that's something you're going to have to think about. So there's likely going to be some sort of centered element or an edge, but in any case, rather than saying center, I should probably say a shared element is probably more. There's definitely going to be April tags and camera vision coming back, particularly because we look at where robotics is going. First tries to do things along where industry leading mentors are going with, and what industry tends to need. And what robotics really needs right now is engineers that understand camera vision, particularly because they've talked a lot about this. And in my opinion, being able to collect a large chunk of these with blob-based detection is going to be the right way to go. There may be terrain making a comeback. We haven't seen terrain in a while. One of the reasons I suggest we might have terrain is that you're seeing those 6-wheel chassis. But again, that could be a bit of red herring, in that the 6-wheel chassis could just be related to the fact that you want more pushing power over that kind of center fighting resource as well. And last thing I suggest is that lifting or multi-height element. The reason I say lifting, there is a potential for a shooter to make a comeback. And the reason I say that is when you look at the starter kit for the 2026-27 season underneath GoBuilda, they have 4 motors. They've got a 1-to-1 conversion kit for a 312 RPM motor. And then they also have a 117 motor here as well, with a couple of 312s. So typically they run their drive motors with their 312s here. Right now they're running the 117 here to be able to do their intake, to get the intake up to a fast enough speed to be able to bring these things in. And then there does leave space for a 1-to-1 conversion. We look at how many traction wheels they end up giving teams. They end up giving teams 5 traction wheels in the end. And then if you look at the upgrade kit, there is an additional traction wheel as well as more compliant wheels, as well as more polycarbonate sections. Now, again, a lot of this could be a bit of a red herring. It's possible we might be seeing a shooter coming back. It's possible not. Having more hogback wheels there maybe gives that idea. But again, it might not be a shooter. It might just be that you are allowed to perhaps launch elements to a certain height to be able to get them up to another height, or you could use a lifting element to be able to get them up and above into that height as well. But it seems to me that we're likely going to have some sort of multi-height element coming back. May it not be a goal you have to launch into, but it might just have to be something in the middle where you're able to bring sections inside and launching at a smaller subsection, perhaps not launching them outside like we did see this season as well. So do I think a shooter coming back is likely? Probably not. Do I think there might be potential for a shooting or a lifting element? I think that might actually be quite likely. Now, in terms of where I think that your team should go, my first suggestion, of course, is get your drivetrain rock solid. Perhaps have a few different drivetrains, something with a tank drive setup, maybe a 6-wheel drop center. I have some tutorials on that as well. Or get yourself a really rock solid intake. Really take this time to dedicate to figuring out what intake makes the most sense for your robot, and how can you really pick these things up as wide as possible and get them into your robot as quickly as possible in the shortest amount of space. And that will likely set you up for the most success coming into the future. It also gives your programmers lots of time to be able to start programming things like blob-based vision to be able to move themselves towards larger blobs of these things and not have to worry about moving things around like that too. And if, on the off chance, terrain ends up making a comeback, having some sort of camera-based localization is likely a decent place to start. I'm curious what your thoughts are about the next season. You've seen my crystal ball now. I wonder what your crystal ball is telling you about this season. Because again, you know as much information as I do at the moment. Let me know in the comments down below. If you like what I do, you can consider joining my community as well to be able to help support me to continue to make more resources for teams on things like this. I'm definitely be having more resources coming out in the future about different robotics tutorials and things like that. And as always, best of luck out there as you prepare for the next season of FTC.